The opinions expressed in the following paid program do not necessarily represent those of WJZ AM 1300, CBS Radio, its employees and sponsors.
This is AHA Business Radio, creating AHA moments for business, by business, and about business, providing opportunities to discover information to help you run your business and guide your decision making. The more you know, the better decisions you make. AHA Business Radio is produced by Alan Hirsch Advisors. For more information, log on to ahabusinessradio.com. To join in tonight's conversation, call 410-481-1300. Now, here's your host for AHA Business Radio, Alan Hirsch.
Good evening. Welcome to tonight's show. My guest tonight is Abba Polikoff. He's the chair of the Maryland Regulatory Reform Commission, which has recently issued a report for 2016, which we'll get into. Abba, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here.
The first question I ask every guest, which not necessarily ties in with my normal kinds of guests, but the question is, what motivates you to get up in the morning and go to work?
Well, what motivates me is there's a lot of good that can be done here personally, for the community, for the city, for the state. And I'm very excited about the opportunity to do something meaningful.
Well, it's and I know you from other areas of the community. I know you also believe in making a difference in people's lives. And by doing this, I would think that's part of what you're doing.
That's what I'm hoping to do.
I hope you're doing it as well. So tell me, how'd you get appointed? And then I'll go with some other questions.
Okay. Well, when during the campaign, when Governor Hogan was running for election, having known him from the Ehrlich administration, I kept bending his ear about the problems that businesses are having in Maryland. I'm a business lawyer. My clients are businesses. And who best to deal with the regulation than the lawyer?
Who has to deal with them on a daily basis and help their clients get through all the regulation.
Absolutely. And I hate, while I like, helping clients, I hate taking money for doing stuff, for getting through a morass that's totally unnecessary. And so I kept harping on that theme during the campaign. So the night after the election, I saw him. He said to me, "Abba, don't go anywhere. I got a job for you."
Well, so obviously you got appointed very early on, and it's been basically 2 years. So tell us a little bit about the commission, what the charge of the commission is. And I know you gave a brief report in 2015, so let's bring us up to date a little bit on a couple of those things.
Great. The charge of the commission is really to review business regulation in the state and to recommend to the governor regulations that are unnecessary, duplicative, obsolete, inefficient, or that just don't safeguard the interests that they were designed to protect. In a nutshell, to improve the regulatory process in a way that would make it easier for business to do business here in Maryland.
Okay, so you took on the responsibility. So how did you start the process, and how did you begin the process, and what was some of the work you did early on?
So we were formed. The commission was formed by executive order in July of 2015. We were then charged to ask the public to relate to us the issues that businesses around the state were having. So we scheduled 6 meetings around the state in different regions of the state to hear the issues that businesses around the state were having to contend with.
So you were asking them what kind of regulations they found to be burdensome, duplicative, and some of the other things you talked about in order so that you as a group, the commissioners, could learn what the issues were.
Correct. And
so what did you find some of the issues were?
Well, we found amazingly in our 2015 report, we noted a number of areas in which the state was really making it difficult for businesses to succeed and to continue to operate, or making it extraordinarily expensive to operate here in Maryland. We had, in these 6 meetings, on average, the hearings were called for 3 hours. Most of the time went to 4 hours, and we heard from about 400 people during that time about the problems that they were experiencing.
Okay, just want to remind the audience out there that I'm Alan Hirsch, and I'm talking to Abba Polikoff, who's the chair of the Maryland Commission, the Regulatory Reform Commission. And if you have any questions or comments, or have any problems with any of the existing regulations, maybe this is the time to ask Abba some questions. So give us a call at 410-481-1300. So what were some of the main things that you found? And out from those some 400, don't want to inflate it, the 400 witnesses, I guess, or speakers that came before the commission.
Speakers and also those who wrote in their comments. We found that, number one, the most important issue they faced was that the regulators tended to deal with the businesses as presumptive wrongdoers rather than a customer relations, customer service attitude, dealing with businesses as if they were actually doing something wrong, and then not returning phone calls or not returning phone calls in a timely manner, not being responsive. Filing times were inordinately long. Permitting processes were expensive, duplicative, and just took much longer, extended the time, and tremendously increased the cost in actually doing those permits.
So one of the big things, and I want to make sure the audience understands that, particularly those that don't deal with regulation, and I never did in most of my businesses, I didn't deal with them because of the separation of free speech in the publishing business. So I didn't have too many regulations to deal with in that area. So the issue was that when a business was coming to the state, a regulatory agency, for approval, they were being treated as and I'll use my language, as an enemy rather than as a customer.
They were not treated well. They were not treated as good customers.
And I know one of Governor Hogan's, and having had Mike Gill on the show a couple times, it's trying to change the state government, these regulations, but also the whole attitude towards customer service promise for our businesses in the state.
And that's been really a theme with Governor Hogan. When he announces the state is open for business, he wants the state employees, who are, by the way, by and large, really good people, really dedicated people. He wants them to treat Maryland businesses as customers, as people you want to come back, as people who are excited about doing business in this state and making it a pleasure to do business with them.
Well, yeah, and I'm a firm believer, and I don't mean this that the customers are always right even when they're wrong, but in a sense, they should be helping business. And I think that's one of the things that you're trying to do with changing some of the regulatory reform, is having the regulatories help business, promote the business, not creating the obstacles to them doing business.
That's correct. And to give you an illustration of how best to see that we had concerns from manufacturers, for example, who are regularly visited by inspectors from the state, who would walk into the plant, walk onto the manufacturing floor or other production facility, and immediately write citations and fines. Well, that's not the way that we thought that should be done, and the governor agreed. The state should be working with the company and say, I see there's an issue here. Here's what we think you ought to do to correct it. And then come back out a few weeks later and see if it's adequately been dealt
In other words, to help them do the improvements.
Correct.
So, and giving, in a sense, a warning. This is a problem. It needs to be fixed. Here's how we suggest you fix it. We'll come back in a few weeks or a month and make sure to see if you've done it correctly.
That's correct. And also from the standpoint of being asked if something can be done, the attitude of the state should be and is now, I can say, turning positively toward that goal. Not a question of can it be done or can't it be done, but a question of how can we help you reach your objective?
Well, that's a perfect time to go to our first commercial break. And as we do, we will have hopefully we'll have the traffic update. And when we come back, I will continue the conversation with Abba Polikoff, who's the chair of the Maryland Regulatory Reform Commission. And later in the show, I will have the AHA Business Trivia Contest, the winner of which gets a gift certificate to the Capitol Grill in Baltimore. I'm Alan Hirsch of Alan Hirsch Advisors, and this is AHA Business Radio on CBS Sports Radio, 1300 AM.
Alan Hirsch.
Welcome back to the show. I'm in the studio with Abba Polikoff. He's the chair of the Maryland Regulatory Reform Commission. If you have any questions or comments or want to know about any questions about regulations in the state, give us a call at 410-481-1300. So we talked in the first segment, Abba, about really the first 6 months setting up the first report. So what was once you had all of this information from the contributors to it, and one thing we didn't talk about is some of the national rankings and the way independent business professionals viewed the state of Maryland, not very favorable as a company doing business. What were the next steps that you as the commission did?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because paramount among our goals was to transform Maryland into a business-friendly state. We realized that we were down in the ratings, and the idea of fixing the regulatory process, not only substantively with the actual regulations, but procedurally and with attitude, the customer relations attitude, we intended to bring Maryland up as one of the more business-friendly states in the union.
Okay, so
what we did, we took a look at all the issues that were raised, and we wrote a report, which we submitted to the governor on December 1, 2015. And in that report, customer relations was a big part of it. It's the waiting time that people had to experience. We recommended processes and procedures that would shorten the time for getting feedback from the state, that would make the state employees more available to the business owners and would actually help them accomplish their goals.
Were you involved? Because I know the last legislature last January approved, and it was a bill about the Change Order Act, I think it's called. Was that something that came up in your discussions where previous contractors in the state would be required to make change orders and never necessarily get paid for them because there's nothing in writing?
That was a constant theme in the various meetings that we had and in the memos that we got, the emails that we got from members of the public. Yes.
So that was actually a concrete result, I guess, partly of that first 6 months work you did.
Yeah, that was.
So congratulations on that, because I've got some state contractors who now feel much better about doing contracts within the state.
Well, thank you very much. and I got to tell you, it was the governor and the lieutenant governor who took a personal interest in those types of issues and actually went out of their way to make sure that something was done about it.
Well, I'm glad that was done, because it put small businesses in some cases out of business.
Yes.
So you went through the process, and what else then? Then what'd you do when you came back and reconvened after that report? I know you have a 95-page report you just issued within the last 3-4 weeks. So how'd you get to that report and with all the information that's in there? Because there's a lot.
There was a lot. And the 2015 report was more general, with the understanding that the 2016 report would actually dig down deeper and make recommendations. And all told, I think there are probably over 200 regulations in the report that are being recommended for modification, repeal, or other changes.
So what was it, without going, and I don't want to be boring and go through the 187 the governor mentioned in the news media, but yeah, the couple of hundred of them that we'll talk about some of them because I'm sure some of them are very interesting. But how did you go about finding all of these? Because there's a process in any type of organization,
right?
And you as a commission, the 9 of you, I guess, had to go through and find these. So what was the process you went through?
Well, one of the things we did early on was we met with the folks at the George Mason University, that is really the source of a lot of these national rankings. And we spent a number of hours with them understanding what goes into the rankings, what we need to do in order to raise Maryland in those rankings. Then we went back and met with the governor's office, the lieutenant governor, and the others who are helping us in this process. And we came to the conclusion that the best way to achieve our objective is to have the state agencies themselves do some introspection, look and see what can be improved, how can it be made more efficient.
So before I ask the next, just remind everybody, I have Abba Polikoff, the chair of the Maryland Regulatory Reform Commission, in the studio with me. If you have any questions, give us a call, 410-481-1300. So how did you, it sounds like having the wolf, manage the chicken coop, because you're asking the regulators to review their regulations.
Well, interestingly enough, they were the ones that were most enthusiastic about making it work and making it work better. And so kudos to the secretaries of the agencies and departments, and to the managers, and to the actual employees themselves that deal with it on an everyday basis, that they came up with a really good, solid list of items that can be done to help improve the state's customer relations.
So which were some, can you outline or give us a list of some of the agencies that actually were, because I will then congratulate all of those agencies and their leaders for really doing the job that so few regulators, in my knowledge, ever do, which is go in and constructively look at what they're doing and make recommendations how to improve it. Because so often you see regulators that just, they don't want change. It's the way it's done. This is the way we do it. And in a lot of businesses, but the fact that they were ready to make change says a lot about the leadership that's going on in some of these departments.
You're right. They're phenomenal people, really good, solid people. Well, the lieutenant governor, who really chairs the effort here, Boyd Rutherford, wonderful guy, really dedicated, very committed, put together 4 work groups. And these work groups were one, environmental and land use, which is chaired by Secretary Mark Belton and Secretary Ben Grumbles. Also stellar individuals, very dedicated in making the environmental and land use regulations meaningful and efficient. The second work group was chaired by Secretary Mike Gill, again, a wonderful guy who chaired the financial services group, together with the insurance commissioner, Al Redmer, who is a very dedicated public servant and very effective in his leadership. The third grouping was occupations and business licensing. That was chaired by Secretary Kelly Schultz. Kelly is a dynamic leader and really took to the forefront, attended many of our commission hearings.
For those who don't, she's Secretary of Labor. And
Secretary of Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation.
Right.
And in fact, that department alone permits, I think Kelly said something like 250,000 licenses or permits are issued by that department alone.
Well, they're responsible, as I understand it, for all of the minority business enterprise approvals in the state of Maryland as well.
Right, I believe so.
Which is a big task.
Yes. And Secretary Schultz attacked this really with vigor, and her staff jumped to the task of reviewing the regulations and coming up with recommendations. Really top-notch people. And finally, the last group was healthcare regulation, which was chaired by former Secretary Van Mitchell, who has departed from that position. That position is now being headed by Dennis Schrader, formerly the appointment secretary. And Dennis is a very, very capable guy, as is Van Mitchell. And I think we're going to see some really good changes in the healthcare group as a result of that.
Well, when we come back from the next break, let's go into and hear talk about some of the regulations that the recommendations you've made in those various work groups. And when we do come back, I will continue the conversation with Abba Polikoff, who's the chair of the Maryland Regulatory Reform Commission. Later in the show, I have the AHA Business Trivia Contest. I'm Alan Hirsch, and this is AHA Business Radio on CBS Sports Radio, 1300 AM.
Now back to AHA Business Radio, creating aha moments for business, by business, and about business. Once again, here's your host, Alan Hirsch.
Welcome back, everybody out there. I'm in the studio with Abba Polikoff, who's the chair of the Maryland Regulatory Reform Commission. And we've really been talking about, up until now, the process. But I think it's very important. I mean, there are 187 listed in the report and other things being done. I really don't want to list them all, but I think it's important for the audience out there, Abba, to understand some of the changes of what they're talking about doing. So, and if you talked about the four work groups. So, for example, in the Occupation and Business Licensing work group, which I think you said Secretary Kelly Schultz was involved with, was almost half of them.
Right.
So, can you give me some examples of some of the regulations that, or are they categorized? Because I think it would be interesting for people to hear what's been causing problems and how some of the fixes are.
Right. So a lot of the fixes deal with the permitting and application process. Number one, first and foremost, and this was very important to the governor, was to do away with the old paper filings, but rather integrate.
You mean it got lost on people's desks?
Right.
So send me another copy, and 2 weeks later call. Oh, I can't find it. Please send me another copy.
And not to mention destruction of all the trees in Maryland for doing this.
Well, actually, having been in the publishing business, there are actually more trees planted for every tree they take down to make paper. But yes, it besides the environmental issue of tearing down the forests, yes.
Right. So the electronic filing was a major change. Now the governor is trying to make this a mandate across state government so that all filing can be done electronically. What this does is it promotes quicker access to the information. It allows for sharing of the information among government agencies, so it eliminates duplicative reviews and allows concurrent reviews to go on at the same time, saving time, saving money, and really making it a lot more efficient. In addition, it shortens the response time required because the information is readily available and can easily be found through searching electronically. This was a major innovation, and also the governor required that this information, that when it is filed electronically, be made available so to integrate at all stages of government.
So is this going to require substantial expenses in reworking the government computer systems and regulatory systems in order to allow businesses the opportunity to send in the registrations and the permits requests and all of that by electronic means? Because we haven't had it in the past. Is this going to create extra expense for the government?
Well, we have the capability right now in the state government.
That answers the question. So you really don't. You have the capability.
But what the governor is also interested in doing is making sure that the technology that's in use by the state keeps up with the current state of technology, so that we're not back in the dark ages in digital commerce.
And one of the things I talk about with my clients is you want the system to fit the business.
Exactly.
Not the business fit the system.
Exactly.
And so they're making sure that the systems that we use fit the needs of the state departments and the regulatory environment within the state.
Correct.
So that's a major part of that. So how many different regulations involved of the 187 might have involved, and maybe you don't know the number, but I would imagine it's a lot of them.
There are quite a few. I don't know the number, but you can imagine that this does require change to many, if not most, of the state requirements. In addition, the other changes required would be to permit or promote the concurrent reviews by different state agencies, as well as by the state agency with federal government review or local area review.
So you could have a regulatory request for building the building in a flood zone, for example, that's going to be local regulatory requirement, might have state regulatory requirements with the land use and the Department of the Environment, and might involve some kind of business permits, and then the federal government might be involved. But by having it all done electronically,
correct, it makes it easier,
so
and
that
more efficient.
all those in that line of regulatory can be doing it simultaneously so that it can cut the time substantially for getting all those approvals.
That's correct. And in addition, we're also reaching out and looking for, the state agencies are reaching out and looking for ways of actually eliminating the duplicative reviews. In one instance, the Department of the Environment is in talks with the federal government about having the state perform certain of the reviews that, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers might perform. Similarly, where there's local permitting required as well as state permitting, the idea would be to have either the state or the local government that would actually have that authorization.
So you're trying to work across jurisdictional lines. One of the things in order to try to get, and one of the things that we talk about, and I know the governor's talked about in the Augustine report, the first one report about changing the way we do business, Department of Commerce was trying to tear down the silos.
Correct.
Of all the departments, so that you have if you have to be two different departments in three different jurisdictions to get approval, trying to streamline that so all of them can work together and not have three sets of people going out and doing the inspection, the reviews, and allowing one of the groups and doing it and the others following suit unless there was problems with it, but following suit and coming along with the regulatory environment. That's what I think you're talking about.
That's
right?
Exactly it.
So that's great. So So being the data, the online, the electronic transfer being one of the major areas, what are some of the other areas of regulatory change that your commission has recommended?
Well, there are changes that have been recommended in one thing we heard all across the state was the requirement of best available technology for removal of nitrogen. This is a problem that has plagued people building commercial buildings as well as residential homes, where the regulation was basically a one-size-fits-all regulation across the board that didn't take into account the needs of the particular areas. Similarly, in the Department of the Environment, Department of Natural Resources had regulations with which both Secretary Belton and Secretary Grumbles really are looking at very scrutiny, with a lot of scrutiny to see where those regulations make sense and where they don't. For example, grading regulations on how much you can grade at any one time and what the process would be for development. That's a critical area for developers, and they are both have paid a lot of attention to that.
So they're trying to consolidate and make more sense out of those regulations. Absolutely.
Also in streamlining and clarifying, for example, regulations regarding motor vehicle administration and dealerships and salespeople. There are changes that are being proposed that would bring us more in the 21st century.
That's amazing. And right there, let's take the next break. When we come back, I will have the AHA Business Trivia Contest, and we'll continue my discussion with Abba Polikoff, the chair of the Maryland Regulatory Reform Commission. So we'll be back in about 3 minutes. I'm Alan Hirsch of Alan Hirsch Advisors, and this is AHA Business Radio on CBS Sports Radio, 1300 AM.
Now back to AHA Business Radio, creating aha moments for business, by business, and about business. And now it's time for tonight's AHA Trivia Question, where you can win great prizes from the AHA Business Radio Show. Call 410-481-1300 if you know the answer. And now with tonight's AHA Trivia Question, here's your host, Alan Hirsch.
Tonight's trivia question: when was the President's Council of Economic Advisors created by Congress? Again, when was the President's Council of Economic Advisors created by U.S. Congress? The first caller with the correct answer at 410-481-1300 will receive a gift certificate to the Capitol Grill restaurant in downtown Baltimore. One of my favorites, by the way. And while we wait for the callers, I'm in the studio with Abba Polikoff, who's the chair of the Maryland Commission on Regulatory Reform, or the Regulatory Reform Commission. I get it backwards sometimes. Before we left, we were talking about some of the major areas of reform that you found, and we were talking about nothing more than electronic filing and bringing the state of Maryland into the digital world. And one of the other things that I noticed, and maybe you can talk about some of it, is that, and I don't know individually, but there appears to be quite a number that deals with obsolescence. Can you tell us about that?
Right. There are a number of regulations that are no longer of any use, either because state law changed or because the facts on the ground have changed. You no longer need to submit computer disks or other outdated modes
of media, computer disks, the paper. The federal government says one thing, and we have to be compliant. So our law hasn't changed, so the regulatory hasn't changed. Those are the kinds of things I think that I saw in the report that just have to be brought up to date.
That's right, and in many instances, their regulations or state or federal laws are no longer in existence, and yet there's still references to them. And those just had to come out of the law. We didn't want people doing unnecessary filings or other actions that just wasted time and wasted money.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I want to talk about and ask you on this whole issue of regulatory reform, one thing is there are people out there, I wish they'd call in but if they have a question about some of the regulatory advancements and changes that might be needed, how can they reach out to the commission? And while you think about that, I have a caller, Adam. Adam, you there?
Yeah, hey, how you guys doing? I'm here.
We're doing fine. Do you know the answer to the trivia question? When was the President's Council of Economic Affairs created by Congress?
Was it Act in 1946?
Absolutely. It's called the Employment Act of 1946. So if you'll hold the line, Nathan will take down your information. We'll get you out that gift certificate as soon as we can.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. So we were just talking that how can the public, the listeners out there, contribute and have their voices heard?
Well, if you go to the governor's website or the lieutenant governor's website, there is a link to the Regulatory Reform Commission. In fact, if you just Google Regulatory Reform Commission of Maryland, it'll take you right there, and you can see the 2015 report and the current report, 2016. There's also opportunity there, instructions on how you can register your issues and put in to the commission your suggestions for any changes in the regulatory process or regulations themselves.
So what's in the next 5-6 minutes that we have, so what are the challenges that you see going forward? Well, first of all, there are 187 plus, maybe as many as 200 regulations that you've talked about tonight that have been recommended to the governor for change. How can those changes be made? What's the process?
Well, normally what's going to happen in a lot of these cases is these changes can be instituted by the agency itself or by executive order from the governor, so that not a lot of procedure is required. There are other instances in which there are regulations that need to follow the Administrative Procedure Act, in which case it may need to be advertised and people given a hearing, the right to a hearing to come and testify one way or the other.
So if it has to go, if it's executive order, the government just can write the order and get it done.
Right.
The other process is whereby the department that has to make the change has to publish it and go through their own regulatory requirements to get the changes made.
That's correct.
Okay. So, and then are there others that might need legislative approval?
Among those that the governor announced, those are more regulatory and don't require legislative action. In the next year, I think, we'll be looking at those types of regulations or actions that will require legislative approval, and we'll be making some recommendations to the governor along those lines.
So so I think you answered my question, but in a little bit more detail. What are the next steps for you and the commission? And where's, you've just introduced 187 plus 200 some regulatory changes that seem to appear, according to the governor, he's made a public statement that they're going to happen. So what are the next steps for the commission, and how difficult is it to get to some of the true regulations? What I see here are some of the superficial things. There are a lot of regulations, whether it's environmental, labor, business licensing, MBEs, minority business ownership programs, that have a lot of regulation to them. what's going to be the process going forward for the commission?
Well, there are a couple different avenues. One, don't forget, the governor had put out his statement on policy for customer service. I believe that there was a separate report that he put out. He titled the bullet points as the customer service promise: friendly and courteous service, timely and responsive, to be accurate and consistent, be accessible, convenient, truthful, and transparent. And that is actually amplified in a policy that the governor has instituted to have the state be more helpful to business, so that it makes it a place where business can operate easily, effectively, efficiently, and more inexpensively. The next steps, however, would be to get some further information on how those changes have actually been implemented, what impact they've made, what further changes need to be made along those lines. We've already noticed a difference in where our ratings are as far as the public perception of doing business in the state of Maryland. And we've noticed a precipitous increase in our rankings. And we're hoping that the next go-round during the next year, what we're going to do is identify those more difficult issues, challenging issues, and try to deal with them in a way that makes it easier for people to do business in Maryland.
Well, that sounds like a great opportunity for businesses in Maryland. So I know there's a lot of environmental regulation, and the more in depth, and for example, and I don't know I'm not involved in the environmental issues, but I know we talk about the streams, we talk about runoff and all those kinds of things, some of which put problems on the hands of businesses. Are those some of the kinds of regulations that you're going to be looking at, and to see if they can be streamlined, like the one on the nitrogen, so they can be streamlined, easier for businesses to understand and get approvals for? Is those are the kinds of things you're going to be looking for? Because from my personal point of view, I think those are the signs of the regulations, without jeopardizing the environment, don't get me wrong, but to make the approval process easier for business.
Yes, make the approval process much easier, not only in the environmental sphere. And I'm glad you mentioned what you did about without jeopardizing the environment, because the governor was very, very clear to us in his directive that we are to look at making recommendations that will reduce the burden on business without jeopardizing the safety or the welfare of the people of Maryland. And that's been a critical point that we need to take into account. And there are also other issues such as professional licensing, requirements for professional licensing, and the different types of review structures for each business or industry in which a person can engage in business.
Well, there's a lot of work to be done. I congratulate you and the commission on the work you've done. I look forward to hearing reports in another year and maybe getting you back and talking about those. So Abba, I do want to thank you for being on the show this evening and outlining the work you've done to help make Maryland a better place to do business. Again, how can they reach you and the commission?
If you look on the website, the governor's or the lieutenant governor's website, you click on Regulatory Reform Commission, or just Google Maryland Regulatory Reform Commission. It'll take you right to our website, and you can see our reports and also voice your concerns.
Again, thank you very much. I want to thank my producer, Nathan. I want to thank my videographer, Larry Wilner of LW BizFlix, for videotaping the show. Please join me next Tuesday at 6 p.m. when my guest will be Anirban Basu of the Sage Policy Group. and we'll be talking about the economic future of the city, state, and nation, and not the world. He's a wonderful economist who brings it down to everyone's level. I also want to wish everyone a happy, healthy, and in business, a prosperous new year. I'm Alan Hirsch of Alan Hirsch Advisors, your host. To reach me, call 443-977-4500 or visit my website, www.alanhirschadvisors.com. This has been AHA Business Radio on CBS Sports Radio, 1300 AM.